stress matters. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota.
Just as the sun rises and you open your eyes and smile, let the day begin. Less stress from you and I. The joy of life is free. Come with me to your place of serenity and all that love is to be happy. As the droplets of water fall to the wayside, know that joy of life is meant for you and me. Live, love, be happy. The Tree of Life.
Good evening. We're back. Less stress matters. Today, we want to talk about a current event that's going on. It's not just a current event, but it's been an event going on for years, also in the lexicon of American culture. And that is, currently right now, there is an attack on the Asian American Pacific Islanders.
We're going to start in Atlanta because there are fears this morning that a string of deadly shootings at massage parlors in the Atlanta area could be linked to a wave of attacks against Asian Americans. 8 people were killed in the city and at least 1 wounded in those attacks yesterday night, and at least half of the victims are believed to be Asian women. The suspect, arrested 150 miles away after a chase, is a white man. His name is Robert Aaron Long.
I want to read to you a statement from the Asian community. And this statement says this: I would like to say the United States is an immigrant country. Everyone who lives on this land should be free and equal. If you bully others today, one day history will tell you the results.
Vicious hate crimes against Asian Americans who've been attacked, harassed, blamed, and scapegoated. At this very moment, so many of them are fellow Americans. They're on the front lines of this pandemic trying to save lives. And still, they're forced to live in fear for their lives just walking down streets in America. It's wrong, it's un-American, and it must stop.
I think that is very appropriate to say that, because America is we call it the melting pot. Many different nationalities, ethnicities, and people of color have come to this country with the thought of an opportunity. And I think that's an appropriate word, the melting pot. But with that being said, everybody's different. Everybody has different cultures, different way of doing things, different way of looking at things. And that helps the diversity of America. And with that helping the diversity of America, there comes some issues. Freedom isn't free. With freedom comes conflict. And with conflict should come understanding and resolution.
The suspected gunman in 3 attacks on Atlanta area spas Tuesday has been charged with 8 counts of murder and 1 count of aggravated assault. 7 of the 8 victims were women, 6 of them Asian. The suspect is a 21-year-old white man. 4 of the victims' names have been released: Delana Ashley Yan, Paul Andre Michaels, Xiaojia Yan, and Dao Yufang. In a news conference Wednesday, Captain Jay Baker of the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department spoke to reporters about the suspect, Robert Aaron Long.
He claims that these, and as the chief said, this is still early, but he does claim that it was not racially motivated. He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction, and sees these locations as something that allows him to go to these places, and it's a temptation for him that he wanted to eliminate.
Sheriff, did you have the sense that he understood the gravity of what he did?
When I spoke with investigators, they interviewed him this morning, and they got that impression that yes, he understood the gravity of it, and he was pretty much fed up and kind of at the end of his rope. And yesterday was a really bad day for him, and this is what he did.
over the last year, there's been 42 attacks on individuals. You know, we always talk about Minnesota Nice. They're not excluded from any of the things that happen throughout the nation. So with that being said, think about that. 42 attacks right here in Minnesota. Again, the current situation is with Atlanta, Georgia. An individual by the name of Robert Long on Tuesday at 5:47 attacked a number of establishments, being Asian massage parlors. When his rampage was over, 8 people had died. 6 of them female and 2 other individuals. A total of 8 people were dead. The amount of attacks that have happened to Asian people over the last year has increased 150%. President Biden last week made a speech talking about this exact same thing. And he denounces it, and he says that this kind of attacks on Asian Americans must stop. But on the other hand,
Dr. Connie Won. She is the co-founder of AAPI Women Lead Organization. AAPI stands for Asian American and Pacific Islanders, and a researcher on violence against girls of color. She's joining us from Oakland, California. Her piece for Elle earlier this month is headlined, "Ignoring the History of Anti-Asian Racism is Another Form of Violence." Dr. Won, welcome to Democracy Now! The words of Captain Baker seem to have framed the discussion. The view of what took place as the narrative of the alleged shooter, that this isn't a hate crime. Can you talk about your response to what took place and how it has now been framed by the police?
Great. Good morning, and thank you for having me on your show. So there's a couple of things, right? Here in the United States in particular, we can't disconnect race from sexism or racial violence from gender violence. That's kind of first and foremost in addressing the police officers' narrative around what took place. I think there's a long-standing history around the hypersexualization, the ongoing sexual violence against Asian women. This has happened across the globe. This occurred during racialized colonial wars in Vietnam, Cambodia, the Philippines, Korea. And so our country has had a long history of sexual violence against Asian women. And so for the police officer and the national narrative to act as if this is not something based upon race is a little bit of a problem. Centering his narrative instead of the survivors or the victims' narratives is also a part of the huge racial violence that this country is essentially guilty of. The way that we have framed the violence against our communities, however, has failed to address the systemic violence against our communities. We have not implicated white supremacy enough. We have not implicated xenophobia enough. We have not implicated gendered violence enough. We haven't even come close to addressing, the conflicts around anti-Blackness within the community enough. And so what the narratives have done is they've individualized these acts of violence. And what we need to do is also have a systemic analysis of what's happening. The other thing around that is when we individualize these acts of violence, especially the way that mainstream media has covered it, what we've done is we've also, some have called for increased hate crime legislation. They've called for more policing, more surveillance. And what they failed to acknowledge when they've done that is that Asian communities are also survivors of racial profiling.
I'm Ken Bastida. Wilson Walker has the video that you'll see only on KPIX5.
Just after 10 o'clock this morning, Market and 7th Streets coming upon the scene during his morning run, KPIX Sports Director Dennis O'Donnell.
There was a guy on a stretcher and a frustrated, angry woman with a stick in her hand.
Shouting in a Toisanese dialect, the 75-year-old woman says she was attacked unprovoked.
The woman said that she was hit and she attacked back. From what I could see, Wilson, she wanted more of the guy on the stretcher.
Again, on Monday, 33 Vietnamese refugees were deported. Now, some of these people came here during the onslaught that happened in Saigon in 75. These people have been here 30, 40 years, and now they get deported back to Vietnam. Well, of course, the Asian community is in uproar about this because on one hand, the president denounces the Asian attacks, and on the other hand, they also consider this an instance of anti-Asianism. We want to say in the black community, to the Asian community, we are in solidarity with you. I want to read a statement. I was given permission to say this by the Circle of Peace movement founder, Russell Ballinger. Mr. Ballinger wants to acknowledge to the Asian community, we are in solidarity with you. I'm going to read his quote. The Circle of Peace movement has condemned all acts of violence. We want the Asian community to know that there is no race. There's only racism. Once again, we want to acknowledge that there's been such an uptick in the violence related to Asian Americans. Another thing is it's being totally unreported. There's been 3,800 reports in 2020, and a lot more have gone unreported. One of the reasons for that is a similar reason that happens to marginalized communities. It comes back down to our law enforcement. Marginalized communities don't feel like law enforcement cares, acts, responds. So with that being said, the numbers are way underreported. Again, we're talking about systemic problems that have been going on for hundreds of years. You know, we're talking about what's happened of late, but this is systemic as well.
Immigrants were just deported a few days ago by President Biden. That to us is also a form of anti-Asian violence. So the media hasn't covered enough of the systemic and long-standing history of violence against Asian communities. What they've done is they've narrowed in on particular incidences, which is important, but they haven't historicized it enough, and they haven't named other forms of violence. And they've called for more policing and surveillance when community organizers have asked for the complete opposite.
We can go far back as 1870. There were some laws enacted in 1875 which banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States. That's in 1875. And there again in 1882, signed by Chester A. Arthur prohibiting all immigrants and Chinese laborers. I mean, these are laws. And I'm not going to get into it right now. I'll get into the specifics of these laws later in this program. But we've got laws far back as 1875, 1882. And they're all related to the Asian population in America. Back to Aaron Long. After he had killed 8 people and was taken into custody and interviewed by a number of people in law enforcement, there was a statement made by a law enforcement official. I'm not going to even mention his name, because the things he said were so ludicrous that it just doesn't bear. That's another thing. When people, I hate to even have to mention the shooter's name, because a lot of these people look at this as to glorify themselves. And by mentioning their name, you continually glorify them. And also with this law enforcement officer, I'm not going to mention his name, but here's what he said briefly. That the individual had a sex problem and that it wasn't a hate crime. And he goes on to say, after the people who had interviewed him and after he talked to the people who had interviewed the shooter, said shooter had a bad day and that's what he did about it. He marginalized the 8 people that got killed, just like they marginalized the 6 people or 10 people that got killed at the Capitol insurrection. So, what are we saying? Entitlement entitles us to kill. Entitlement entitles us to kill. Entitlement entitles us to kill. He didn't talk about the victims. He humanized the shooter. Wow. Right now, currently, there's 2 Asian American females, one from Hawaii and another representative, Hiroshima, and Representative Ming. They're trying to introduce an anti-Asian hate crime bill related to COVID-19.
The other thing is that I think the surge that we see today or now has a lot to do with the coverage, which is also meaning we see more of what's happening. But at the same time, we can't separate this moment from Trump's administration. We can't separate it from the fact that this global pandemic that has killed so many people and has hurt so many lives was blamed on, or was called the China virus, was called the Wuhan virus, or what the Georgia sheriff said was what did he call it? The China, it came from China. So it makes sense to, well, it doesn't make sense, but I think we can implicate and say that this rise in violence today is because we're being scapegoated largely by the previous administration.
I want to read from a statement from Dr. Michelle O, a physician and Georgia state senator. She's the first Asian American Georgia state senator. Dr. O wrote, quote, "Our AAPI community has been living in fear this past year in the shadow of escalating racial discrimination and attacks. This latest series of murders only heightens that terror. I implore all Georgians and all Americans to reach out to your Asian American neighbors and to pledge to stand with them in solidarity." She gave a speech on the floor of the legislature right before the attack, with this heightened, this escalating violence against Asian Americans.
So again, I want to mention that earlier act, it was called the Page Act of 1875, which banned Chinese women from immigrating to the United States. That was called the Page Act. We, again, in the black community want to make it known that until all of us are free, none of us are free. And there's no separation, there's only distance and time. And with distance and time, we hope to close the distance and shorten the time to when we can all sit down and come up with solutions that will help this great country. This is a great country. I hear things all the time, and some of them good, and some of them necessarily need to be said. Last couple weeks ago, presentation, and in the presentation, a number of people were telling how they felt about different things. And one thing that surprised me was a number of individuals from different countries who had been here quite a while says, "I finally made my mind up. I no longer want to be in this country. I'm actually going to go back to where I'm from because there's so much hatred here, so much venomous acts, and the way people's mentalities are changing because of entitlement." And that was very surprising for a number of the other people in the room to hear people say that they're leaving America because they don't want their kids to grow up in this kind of environment. They consider it toxic.
AAPI community has been living in fear this past year in the shadow of escalating racial discrimination and attacks. This latest series of murders only heightens that terror. I implore all Georgians and all Americans to reach out to your Asian American neighbors and to pledge to stand with them in solidarity. She gave a speech on the floor of the legislature right before the attack, with this heightened, this escalating violence against Asian Americans. And I was wondering, Dr. One, if you can also go further and talk about these massage parlors. We don't know if the victims, some of the victims were sex workers, but you are writing, you've just finished a chapter on the dangers that sex workers of color, including massage parlor workers, face by police, clients, and now more definitively, white racist misogynists. Talk about this in the context of what we see happening now.
Sure. So I think, what we have to recognize around the women and the men who were recently killed is that many of them were working in low-wage jobs, right? Which means that they were exploited, they were underprotected, they were under-resourced. I learned that some of the women who were killed were actually living in that spa, living in that massage parlor. That means that they, were living under conditions of, poverty. So I want us to really highlight that. And I also want to talk about the ways that massage parlor workers, low-wage workers, sex workers, we tend to come from, this industry, massage parlors and sex workers, the sex trade is a criminalized and stigmatized industry. which means that we are subject to criminalization, subject to police violence. Many of the massage parlors across the country have been subject to police raids. A few years ago in New York, there was a woman who was killed or who died. Her name is Yang Sun. She was Asian, a Chinese woman who was running and escaping from the police. We learned later that she also shared that she had been a survivor of someone who had a badge. They had coerced her to be an informant, and she was running away from one of the raids. So massage parlors and other informal industries, including the sex trade, are really, we're survivors of the criminal justice system, which is why when mainstream media or, politicians or others call for more policing and surveillance in response to the violence that massage parlor workers faced, including these women who were killed, you're calling for more violence against our communities. And that isn't the answer either, right? So I think what's very painful at this moment is that while Asians in particular are being subject to so much interpersonal violence, including death, we also cannot rely on a criminal justice system that has also caused deaths, and that of Black communities.
So think about that, America. We've been considered to be one of the greatest countries because of the opportunities. Again, I want to mention something about one of the greatest empires ever, which was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, as great as it was, it crumbled. It crumbled because of a situation that we're actually going through now in this country. It's called schism. And schism is when you have everybody in government, both sides, fighting against each other to where neither side gets anything done. So if neither side gets anything done, who's in the middle? Who is government? Government is us. So if neither side gets anything done, so that means nothing gets done for the American public. Nothing. And who do you think's paying for it? You're paying for it. I'm paying for it. But we're not getting what we're paying for. We're getting pain, suffering, anguish, disappointment, and no progress. Do you know America hasn't had progress in the last 30 years? We haven't had any progress in 30 years. We've had technology, but we haven't had progress. And remember, with technology, anytime you have technology, you leave behind something. That has to start being accounted for. What you leave behind has to be counted in on where you're headed for or where you're headed to. Because if you don't, you eliminate your past. And if you have no past, you really don't have no future. You just have time and space and a place.
Police now say there was a second victim this morning, an 83-year-old Asian man. A 39-year-old man is now being investigated for both attacks, and police say they are working to determine if bias was a factor.
We have to do our jobs. We have to investigate these cases with all resources brought to bear, and we need to make arrests, which we've done that.
Today, both the police chief and the mayor highlighted the arrests made in connection with previous attacks in the city, promising more targeted patrols.
We need to understand not only what was going on and why those attacks occurred, because in some cases they didn't include any robbery or theft.
As for one case that did include robbery, police have announced 3 arrests in connection with the violent attack caught on camera in a San Francisco laundromat. Police say the suspects, all arrested in Antioch, are also tied to 8 car burglaries in the city.
So again, you have a small group of individuals. All of those 3 that were arrested lived outside the city.
stress matters. Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota.